Greg Norman once stood in a place that most golfers only dared to dream of. He wasn't just a champion, he was a global icon of modern golf throughout the 1980s and 1990s, with more than 90 professional victories around the world, two major titles at the Open Championship, and especially 331 weeks holding the world #1 ranking, one of the greatest records in golf history. Greg Norman dominated the sport with a ferocious attacking style, absolute confidence, and the aura of a true predator. The nickname the Great White Shark wasn't just a media image. It perfectly reflected the way he entered every tournament, overwhelming, merciless, and always carrying the feeling that everything could be conquered. He was the face of Australian golf on the global stage, the one who forced courses in America, Europe, and Asia to rethink how they viewed the physical strength, mental toughness, and commercial power of a golfer. Greg Norman didn't just win on the grass, he shaped golf as an industry, becoming one of the rare athletes who stepped away from the course and still wielded deep influence in business, golf course design, and sporting power. At his peak, he wasn't just a winner, he was the standard by which others were measured, but running parallel to those dazzling achievements was a silent pain that lasted his entire life. Greg Norman wasn't brought down by a lack of talent, he was worn down by the moments when fate turned its back at the exact instant he trusted it most. There were Sundays when he stepped onto the course with every advantage, only to walk away in silence, carrying the feeling that history had closed right in front of him without giving him a chance to explain. The most frightening thing is that he didn't run from it. He didn't blame others, didn't disappear, didn't let failure define his entire being. Greg Norman kept competing, kept winning, kept showing up in public standing tall, even though inside were cracks that would never heal. His strength wasn't in rewriting history, it was in living with it, accepting that some pains can't be fixed, they can only be carried. That resilience, that steadfastness, is the least mentioned part of Greg Norman's legacy, a man not favored by fate, but who never let go in the face of adversity. If you want to keep following the story of the hidden corners, the pain, and the extraordinary will behind the legend of Greg Norman, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part. Thank you for joining us, and we'll dive deeper into the journey that fate never let go of in the next part of the video. After that question that never quite settled, the story has to turn back to where it all began, not to find a loud tragedy, but to recognize the tiny seed that quietly grew alongside Greg Norman from his early years. Greg grew up in a world built on discipline, sports, and rules that were clear to the point of being cold. His childhood in Australia wasn't a story of poverty or misfortune in the usual sense, but it was harsh in a different way. Everything had rules, every effort had to be proven, and a person's worth was measured by how well they performed. In his family and surroundings, Greg learned early that weakness had no place, that if you wanted respect, the only way was to be better than everyone else. Sports became the common language of that world, and golf, with its straight shots, clear numbers, quickly emerged as the perfect game for a boy who believed absolutely in fairness. From a very young age, Greg Norman was captivated by the idea that golf is the sport of honesty, where no one can cheat for long, where the final result exactly reflects ability and character. On the practice range, he threw himself into training with near absolute belief that if he hit better, prepared more thoroughly, practiced harder, then victory would come as an inevitable consequence. For Greg, golf wasn't just a sport, it was a moral system. Whoever does it right gets rewarded, whoever is better wins, and there's no room for cruel randomness. That pure belief drove his astonishingly rapid progress, carrying him through each level with rare confidence, as if the world was designed for those who follow the rules to the end. But right there the tragedy began to take root, quietly, without immediate pain. Greg Norman didn't grow up with doubt, didn't learn to guard against fate, wasn't taught that there would be days when the game turns its back even when you do everything right. In his mind, destiny wasn't something to negotiate with, let alone something to watch out for. He believed that if he was good enough, tough enough, disciplined enough, then life and sports would have to acknowledge it. That belief wasn't wrong morally, but it was fragile against a far harsher reality. Golf, like life, isn't always kind to the most honest players. When Greg Norman entered adulthood, carrying the baggage of natural talent and meticulous preparation. He had no idea that this very purity would make the blows from fate later hurt many times more. Someone who believes in fairness suffers failure differently from someone who always doubts. Someone who doesn't guard against destiny gets wounded deeper when destiny decides to test him. Greg didn't enter the world of golf with the mindset of someone fighting injustice. He entered with the simple belief that if you hit it right, hit it well, and hit it long enough, history would stand on your side. He didn't know that history sometimes doesn't choose anyone's side. Looking back, that childhood wasn't the direct cause of the later pains, but it was the soil where tragedy could take root. A boy raised in discipline and sports, growing up with absolute faith in fairness, would become a great man when everything followed the rules, but would also become the most vulnerable when the rules suddenly lost their mercy. Greg Norman wasn't prepared to doubt the game because he believed in it too much, and that very pure belief, the thing that once lifted him so high, quietly set him on the path to a long tragedy, where every later fall wasn't just a loss, it was a betrayal of what he'd believed his whole life. From the soil of that absolute belief, Greg Norman's rise happened so fast that even those around him barely had time to understand what was happening. Success came early, almost without giving him time to doubt himself. While many golfers of his generation were still scrambling for a foothold, Greg stepped straight to center stage with the bearing of someone born to win. Those powerful swings, the unrelenting attacking play, the cold eyes when stepping up to the tee box, all created an image completely different from what golf had known before. He didn't wait for opponents to make mistakes, he forced them to err with constant pressure, and from that style, the nickname Great White Shark was born, not as a media gimmick, but as an acknowledgement of the predatory instinct in how he conquered every tournament. At that time, Greg Norman didn't just win, he dominated. Every appearance carried the feeling that this golf course would belong to him, that everything else was just details to finish. American media quickly got swept up in the whirlwind, building the image of a new force, a ruler coming to claim the throne. Great White Shark wasn't just a nickname, it became a collective expectation. People no longer asked if Greg could win, they asked how he would win, and by how many strokes. And in that praise an invisible pressure began to form, heavier than any opponent he'd ever faced. Early success always has two sides, and for Greg Norman its dark side arrived very quietly. Each new win didn't just add a trophy, it built higher the perfect image he had to live with. The Great White Shark wasn't allowed to weaken, wasn't allowed to hesitate, wasn't allowed to have a bad day. The aggression that was once a weapon gradually became the standard he had to maintain. When you're praised as a predator, people don't let you retreat or slow down. And Greg, with his pure belief in fairness, didn't even realize he was stepping into a different fight, one far more dangerous than any tournament. He wasn't just battling the golfers across the fairway, he began battling the very image the world had built of him. Every shot was no longer just a technical choice, it was an affirmation that the Great White Shark was still there. Every round was no longer just 18 holes, it was a test of whether he still deserved the expectations he'd created himself. Greg Norman became a prisoner of his early excellence, forced to live in the role of a man not allowed to fail, and in golf, a sport already ruthless with the smallest mistakes, that was an enormous burden. The painful part is that Greg didn't resist it. He didn't try to soften the image, didn't step back to protect himself. Instead, he believed that if he just kept playing the right way, if he just held his form, then that perfect image wouldn't become a burden. He believed talent big enough could withstand any pressure. But right there, talent began to take on the shape of a curse. The better he got, the bigger the expectations swelled, the more dominant he was, the narrower the space for failure became. And when that space disappeared, all it took was one off moment for the entire image to collapse in cruel silence. From the outside, this period was the most brilliant stretch of Greg Norman's career, but from the inside, it was when he began living with a pressure no one talked about, the pressure to always be himself at his most perfect version. He was no longer allowed to just be Greg Norman, a talented golfer still learning and growing. He had to be the Great White Shark all the time, on every course, in front of every audience. And in that confrontation, the most dangerous opponent wasn't standing across from him, it was right there in the mirror, the perfect image he had to protect at all costs. Right from there, the tragedy began to take on a clearer shape. The talent had lifted Greg Norman incredibly high, but it also placed him in a position where just one slip would ensure history never forgot. When expectations are that massive, failure stops being part of the journey and becomes an indelible stain. And Greg Norman, with all his confidence and belief in fairness, kept moving forward, completely unaware that the very talent that once supported him was slowly turning into a curse, pulling him toward a confrontation he was never prepared to endure. When Greg Norman reached the pinnacle of the golf world, it wasn't a brief explosive moment, it was a suffocatingly prolonged state. 331 weeks at world number one wasn't just a record number, it was a stretch of time long enough for a person to be shaped, framed, and imprisoned by his own peak. During those years, Greg Norman wasn't simply the planet's best golfer, he became an icon that American media desperately needed. After the era of the old legends, golf required a new king, a face strong enough to carry the entire sport on his shoulders, glamorous enough to draw crowds, fierce enough to generate stories. And Greg Norman, with his cool demeanor, unrelenting attacking play and natural charisma, was crowned with that crown, even though he was never asked if he was ready. At number one, Greg didn't just represent himself, he represented the entire weight of expectations from a golf world searching for its successor. Each passing week at the top didn't bring relief, it piled on more pressure. Each new ranking release wasn't congratulations, it was a reminder that he wasn't allowed to slip. The pinnacle, in Greg Norman's case, wasn't a reward for what he'd achieved. It was a harsh place where every mistake was magnified, every failure remembered longer than every victory. American media began speaking about him in a language that was both admiring and demanding. He was called the Dominator, the new standard, the measuring stick for anyone who stepped onto the course. But running alongside that praise was a silent question that never went away. When would he win enough majors to be absolutely worthy of this throne? That very question turned every week at number one into an invisible countdown. The longer Greg Norman stayed on top, the heavier the pressure grew to prove himself with majors. Ordinary wins started to lose value, while failures in the big events became scratches impossible to hide. The painful part is that Greg didn't dodge that pressure. He entered every major with the mindset of someone who believed he belonged there. But golf, unlike many other sports, doesn't award crowns based on long-term consistency. It awards them based on very short, very cruel moments. You can dominate all year, but one off week and history turns its back. And when Greg Norman lived too long at the peak, he was no longer allowed those off weeks. In that suffocating peak, Greg gradually realized a bitter paradox. The higher you stand, the narrower the space for being human becomes. He was no longer permitted to be a golfer still developing, still learning from mistakes. He had to be the perfect king, where every swing carried the weight of inevitability. Every round in a major became a test of identity. Every missed putt wasn't just a technical error, it was a crack in the crown the whole world was watching. That suffocation didn't come from any specific opponent. It came from the crowd's gaze, from the newspaper pages, from the sidebar stories, where Greg Norman was always referred to as the man who should have won more. That phrase, repeated over the years, turned into a suspended sentence hanging over his head. No one openly condemned him, but no one allowed him to breathe easy either. The peak became an invisible cage, where every movement was monitored, every step compared to an ideal that existed only in the public's imagination. And inside that cage, Greg Norman still tried to keep his balance with the belief that had followed him since childhood. Fairness will come if you're good enough, persistent enough. He believed his world number one status was proof of that. But that very belief made him endure the pressure in the cruelest way. Because when you believe absolutely in fairness, every time it fails to appear, the pain isn't just in the result, it's in the betrayal of the entire belief system you've built your whole life around. In this phase, Greg Norman never collapsed. On the contrary, he stood tall, kept fighting, kept holding world number one for so long that it became part of who he was. But inside, something had begun to change. The peak was no longer a place to enjoy, it was a place to defend. Each week at number one wasn't a new victory, it was a week survived without failure. And when the peak turns into a place where mistakes aren't allowed, tragedy stops being a distant possibility and becomes an inevitability, quietly waiting for its moment. When Greg Norman had grown accustomed to living at the peak, the tragedy didn't arrive with one fatal blow. It came through final rounds that stretched out like chronic pain. No booze, no harsh accusations, just Sundays slipping by in silence, where victory seemed so close, then quietly slipped away. These weren't early failures where you could tell yourself you weren't good enough yet. These were final rounds where everything had been prepared, where Greg stepped onto the tee box as the leader, carrying the belief that this time fairness would show up on schedule. But golf, like life, doesn't follow anyone's timetable. Those final rounds began to haunt in a very particular way. No catastrophic shots right from the start, no clear collapse to point fingers at. Instead, there were tiny deviations, putts that lipped out, approaches that came up a few inches short, decisions that seemed right, but led to wrong outcomes. On the leaderboard, the gap narrowed bit by bit, and Greg, who once overwhelmed entire courses, began to feel a new pressure, the pressure of time slipping away in silence. Sunday, the day born to crown champions, gradually became the day of heavy waiting. No one openly called it weakness. American media at the time still gave Greg Norman the respect due a great champion, but between the lines, doubt began to creep in. So close, just short, should have won. Those seemingly harmless phrases repeated enough times turned into an unspoken question. Why did someone so talented, so consistent, so often stand right on the edge of victory at the end of the week, yet not be the one whose name was called? That doubt didn't need to be shouted, it lived in the eyes, in the quiet nods, in the way audiences held their breath every time Greg approached the final holes. For Greg, the scariest thing wasn't the external doubt, it was the feeling that he was starting to notice it. Final rounds were no longer places to unleash attacking instinct, they became places to preserve, to protect, to think twice before every shot. He didn't panic, didn't lose his form, but a new caution appeared, very thin, very hard to name. Greg Norman was still the great white shark, but that shark was now swimming in waters where every movement was watched more closely than ever. Those quiet Sundays that stole victories didn't just take away trophies, they took something far harder to notice, the sense of inevitability. Before, when Greg played well, victory felt like the logical outcome. Now, even when he played well, victory became something to wait for, to hope for, to pray for. And when you start hoping for what used to be certain, you've taken a long step away from the safety of your original belief. Greg never said it out loud, but in the slow walks off the green on Sunday afternoons, something had changed. No one stepped forward to criticize him harshly, his record was still too big to deny, but silence can sometimes be crueler than accusation. That silence allowed history to begin whispering. It didn't speak plainly, didn't conclude. It just posed the question and repeated it. Greg began to hear that whisper behind him, not with his ears, but with feeling. Every time he entered a final round with the lead, he knew that if he didn't win, that question would get another period added. No one needed to write it down, everyone already understood. The tragedy accumulated right there. Not one single fall, but a series of small slips never big enough to call disasters, yet enough to wear down belief. Greg Norman didn't lose his ability to play elite golf, he gradually lost the right to believe that playing well was enough. And when someone who's lived his whole life on faith and fairness starts to doubt it, the pain doesn't come in a crash, it comes in prolonged silence. In this phase, history hadn't yet condemned Greg Norman, but it hadn't forgiven him either. It simply stepped back, watched, recorded each Sunday that passed without a trophy. And Greg, though still standing tall, still smiling for the cameras, had begun walking in a new space, where every final round wasn't just a battle with opponents on the leaderboard, but a battle with a story being written behind his back, line by line, in the invisible ink of doubt and regret. Augusta National that morning was still beautiful in the way it always is, perfect to the point of cruelty, and Greg Norman walked onto the course not carrying the feeling of someone about to collapse, but carrying one last belief that everything would finally fall back into order. The Masters in 1996 didn't start as a tragedy. It started as a promise. After 3 rounds, Greg led by 6 strokes, a margin big enough to make people believe that this time history would listen. No showboating, no smug moments, just a man who'd lived too long with Sundays swallowing victories, stepping into decision day with the simple hope that finally fairness would arrive on time. But Augusta isn't a place that hands out gifts to those who deserve them. It's a place that exposes the fragility of belief. That Sunday didn't need a loud disaster to become the deepest cut in Greg Norman's life. It unfolded slowly, almost politely, hole by hole, shot by shot, as if the golf course deliberately stretched out the pain so the person inside couldn't escape. There was no single shot that immediately signaled the worst, just balls that no longer followed their familiar paths, putts that rolled slower than intended, moments when Greg stood on the green and felt the distance between intention and result suddenly become alien. For someone with absolute faith in the link between doing things right and being rewarded, that feeling wasn't just disappointment, it was betrayal. The silence of the crowd at Augusta that day carried an unusual weight. No one booed, no one cheered excessively for the opponent, but every time Greg made one more small deviation, the air seemed to thicken. The sparse applause no longer felt like encouragement, it resembled the quiet witnessing of a crowd in the presence of something no one wanted to say out loud. Augusta National is famous for its solemnity, but that day that solemnity became an invisible courtroom where Greg Norman stood alone before the gaze of history. The leaderboard was the cruelest thing because it had no emotion, no context, no knowledge of the years Greg had lived at the peak or the Sundays that had quietly stolen victories before. Every changing number was a cold cut, recording reality without explanation. The 6-stroke lead vanished so quickly that even Greg couldn't grasp how, not because he played bad golf, but because everything he believed was solid ground suddenly shook at once. Shots that were once instinct now demanded thought, and that very thinking broke the rhythm that had followed him his whole life. The Masters in 1996 wasn't the story of Greg Norman not handling the pressure in the simple way people often label big failures. It was the story of a man placed in a moment where everything he believed in turned its back at the same time. Fairness didn't show up. Preparation wasn't enough to save him. Experience offered no guarantee. Greg didn't panic, but he lost control of the most important thing, the right to believe that if he did it right the result would follow. And when that belief collapsed, everything else became a chain reaction. There are moments in a person's life when history seems to intervene directly, not with obvious brutality, but with absolute coldness. Augusta National that day was like a stage where every detail kept its beauty, while the story inside shattered. Greg Norman kept walking, kept hitting shots, kept finishing the round, because that's what a champion does. But deep inside he knew something had slipped from his grasp, not the trophy, but the right to keep writing his life story the way he'd imagined it for so many years. When the round ended, there were no crowd roars, no chaotic scenes, just a long heavy silence, as if even Augusta was trying to understand what had just happened. To the world, it was one of the most dramatic Sundays in Masters history. To Greg Norman, it was the day history veered in a different direction, taking him along without giving him a choice. Every effort before, every success after, would be pulled back to this moment as an unerasable reference point. The moment Greg Norman lost control of his life's history didn't happen in one single shot, but in the slow realization that some failures can't be fixed, they can only be carried. When he left Augusta National, he didn't leave as someone broken, but as someone who understood his story had just been rewritten by another hand. From that instant, Greg Norman was never looked at the same way again. Every time he stepped onto a course in the years that followed, every victory he claimed, every effort he made, all came with an invisible parenthesis named Augusta 1996. What made that Masters so painfully timeless wasn't that Greg Norman lost. It was the way he lost in the silence of someone who had done everything right according to what he believed. He wasn't punished for cheating, wasn't paying for moral mistakes. He was swept into a moment where the game he loved most suddenly showed no mercy. From then on, every time history called Greg Norman's name, it didn't just call a golf legend, it called along with it a question that was never fully answered. How could someone who'd prepared his whole life for victory be denied by fate at the exact moment he trusted it most? And that question, born at Augusta National that day, became an irreparable fracture that followed him for the rest of his life. After Augusta, Greg Norman didn't walk into a noisy storm, he fell into a long, suffocating quiet. No scandal, no confession, no moral slip for the media to latch onto and explain the tragedy. He didn't speak up in defense, didn't try to rewrite that Sunday with words of support. Greg kept showing up, kept competing, kept holding the calm demeanor of a champion too familiar with pressure. But that silence, instead of being respected, became space for another story to form freely. When there are no explanations, history starts writing itself. American media, which once placed the crown on his head, no longer extended its arms. They didn't need to turn their backs openly, just changing their tone was enough. Articles became more cautious, commentary added phrases like, should have, if only, perhaps. No one condemned Greg Norman, but no one rushed to defend him either. Sympathy, if any, flickered and vanished in the next news cycle. In a sports culture accustomed to celebrating the ultimate winner, patience for pains without resolution is always very short. Greg understood that, but didn't fight back. He didn't argue with the press, didn't seek behind-the-scenes stories to prove he deserved better. He chose to move forward in silence, believing time would do its part. But time, in this case, didn't heal, it froze. Greg Norman's image became fixed in the Augusta moment, like a photo no one would take down. Every time he appeared afterward, no matter the course, the public's eyes unconsciously returned to that Sunday. No one said it, but everyone remembered. With no scandal to overshadow, no defense to spark debate, Greg Norman's story became awkward in a very American way. He didn't fit the villain role, nor was he fully intact as the hero. He hovered between the two images, and that very hovering left the media unsure where to place him. His silence was misinterpreted as resignation, while his continued competing was seen as an attempt to cling to something already lost. In that telling, Greg Norman gradually became imprisoned in an image he didn't choose, the image of the man who had his chance, and let it slip away. The most painful part was that he wasn't given the chance to escape that image through his own achievements. Every victory afterward was placed in parentheses around Augusta. Every failure, no matter how small, was pulled back as evidence. There was no fairness Greg once believed in, just an invisible double standard, where he had to win more than others to be seen as equal, yet remembered longer whenever he didn't win. And in a media world that always needs tidy stories, Greg Norman became a story too complicated to be fully loved. Greg didn't resent the public, but he began to understand that history's mercy isn't a given. No scandal meant no climax to then be forgiven for. No defense meant no resolution for others to nod at comfortably. His quietness, born from self-respect, was interpreted as a full stop, and from then on, every time he stepped onto a course, he wasn't just competing against opponents, he was competing against a story already shaped that he had no right to edit. In the years after Augusta, Greg Norman continued to live as a man accustomed to being seen through a distorted lens. He didn't collapse, but he wasn't set free either. He stood tall, but stood in a narrow frame built by others. The aftermath trauma wasn't in the immediate pain, it was in its duration, a pain not acknowledged big enough to be healed, nor loud enough to be forgotten. And when mercy didn't come, Greg Norman had to learn to live with that silence, carrying it as part of himself in a world that had decided to remember him in a way he never chose. After those quiet post-trauma days, Greg Norman didn't disappear, didn't withdraw from the courses the way people often do when carrying an unhealed wound. He kept competing, kept walking the fairways with his familiar stride, kept finishing golf rounds at a level few of his contemporaries could sustain. Greg still won, still lifted trophies, still put his name on leaderboards, but one thing never shifted. Every gaze was still pulled back to Augusta. No matter which course he was on, no matter where the victory came from, the 1996 moment hung there like a frozen frame, not allowing the story to flow naturally with time. To many, Greg Norman's career afterward was a series of new chapters. To history, it was just footnotes added around an old photograph. Greg realized this very early. not through direct words, but through the way his victories were received. New titles were no longer seen as affirmations, but as attempts to make up for something. People praised him for still being excellent, but always with an unnamed pause, as if everyone was waiting for something that would never come. Augusta became the invisible yardstick, and everything else was compared, diminished, placed secondary. Greg Norman didn't lose to new opponents, but he lost to a moment he could never go back and fix. Living inside a freeze frame isn't like living with an ordinary sad memory. Memories can fade, can be softened by time, but a frozen frame doesn't. It keeps every detail, every emotion, every unanswered question exactly as it was. Greg moved forward in his career like a man always carrying a mirror placed behind his back. Every time he turned his head, even just for a glance, the image was still there, not aging, not changing, not forgiving. And the painful part was that he had no right to choose whether to carry it or not. History had attached it to his name long ago. In those years, Greg Norman learned how to compete without expecting release. He no longer believed that another victory, no matter how big, would erase Augusta from the collective memory. He only knew that if he stopped, that frame would become the entire story. So he kept going, not to prove anything to the world, but to keep himself from being completely swallowed by a single Sunday. His resilience didn't carry a heroic glow. It carried the color of prolonged endurance, where every step was taken with the awareness that no final reward was waiting. Greg still won, but the joy of victory was no longer pure. Every time he lifted a trophy, he understood it would be placed next to an old question. Every time he stood in front of the cameras, he felt the invisible expectation of the public, not expecting him to win more, but expecting him to get over Augusta. And when that didn't happen the way they imagined, the silence returned. No one openly expressed disappointment, but no one truly breathed a sigh of relief either. Greg Norman lived in a bitter paradox. He was good enough to keep winning, but not lucky enough to be freed from a single moment. That freezing didn't just affect how others saw him, it seeped into how he saw himself. Greg didn't blame himself, but he was forced to live with the awareness that all his efforts would always be read through an old lens. That required a different kind of will from the will to win. It was the will to keep existing inside a story you no longer controlled. Greg Norman kept stepping onto the course not because he believed history would change its mind, but because he refused to let history decide whether he could continue living as a golfer or not. The years after Augusta therefore carried the shape of a prolonged tragedy. No new climax to replace the old one, no redemptive moment to close the painful chapter, just the repetition of effort, victory, and silence. Greg kept living inside a moment he couldn't escape, like a man forced to keep walking in a room where the back wall always held the same image. And in that repetition, the most pitiable thing wasn't that he never won again. It was that every victory of his was never enough to pull him out of the frame that had been frozen long ago. As the story on the course gradually froze into an inescapable moment, Greg Norman's personal life also quietly cracked in a way that wasn't loud but long and exhausting. No sensational headlines, no public arguments for outsiders to easily point at, just a silent erosion of relationships placed last for too long. Family, for Greg, didn't collapse in one single event. It wore away day by day, trip by trip, tournament after tournament. When a person lives too long with the schedule, with the pressure, with those heavy Sundays, presence becomes a luxury, and absence, even if unintentional, always leaves a void. Greg's marriage lasted many years, long enough for outsiders to believe it was solid. But inside, that solidity gradually turned into depletion. Two people coexisting in an orbit where golf was always at the center, where every plan revolved around the competition schedule, where conversations were cut short by the next flight. No one was the bad guy, no one deliberately hurt anyone. It's just that when one person pours all their energy into confronting history, the energy left for family is often not enough. Greg didn't abandon his family in the usual sense, but he lost the ability to be fully present, and that's the hardest kind of loss to see, and the hardest to repair. For many years, the golf course became the only place Greg Norman could be himself. There, Everything was clear, fair in the way he'd believed since childhood. You hit the ball, you accept the result, you move on. No unfinished conversations, no emotions needing explanation. On the course, Greg didn't have to strain to be husband, father, or the man balancing multiple roles. He was just a golfer facing the hole, the wind, the grass, himself. That clarity gave him a rare sense of safety, especially as the outside world grew more complicated and demanded more than he could give. But the very place that gave him that safety was also the place that took everything else away. Every time Greg chose the golf course to find peace, he simultaneously moved away from the rooms that needed his presence most. Late nights, long trips, important moments missed, not out of malice, but because of a deeply ingrained belief that if he could hold on to his career, everything else would be fine. Unfortunately, family life doesn't operate on the logic of sports. It has no scoreboard to show how much you're losing by, no final round to fix mistakes. By the time Greg realized the distance had become habit, many gaps were already too wide for a simple apology to bridge. That quiet breakup didn't turn Greg into a bitter man. On the contrary, it made him quieter. He didn't talk much about his private life, didn't blame the schedule, the media, or fate. He understood that he'd chosen this path, and every choice has its price. What made the pain deeper was the feeling that there was no quiet room to retreat to. Family was no longer a place he could return to and set down the burden of the course, while the course increasingly carried the shadow of the losses that had happened off it. Greg lived in a state of constant motion, but rarely truly rested. Those years taught Greg Norman a harsh lesson about the loneliness of prolonged success. When you win early, stand high, and stay there too long, people assume you're always okay. Few ask how you're living when the cameras aren't rolling, when there's no applause. Few realize that the silence after an exhausting day of competition can be heavier than any failure. Greg wasn't abandoned by the crowds, but he also wasn't surrounded by a personal life strong enough to withstand the long days. The golf course therefore became both refuge and exposure. There, Greg Norman could forget the empty rooms, but right there he also had to face the truth that there was nowhere else to run. The tragedy of his personal life wasn't in arguments or dramatic breaks. It was in the prolonged absence of a sense of belonging. And when a man no longer has a quiet room to return to, every victory, no matter how big, is just a short echo in a space that's growing wider and colder. After the quiet cracks in his personal life, Greg Norman's tragedy moved to a deeper layer, where the pain no longer took personal shape but became a moral issue of history. He didn't cheat, he didn't break rules, he didn't take shortcuts, didn't touch the gray areas of the game he'd believed in since boyhood. Throughout his career, Greg Norman represented the image of a golfer who played fair openly, without hiding, without tricks. But ironically, that very purity made his tragedy awkward for collective memory. Because when there's no clear guilt, history still needs an explanation, and if it can't find the cause in behavior, it will find it in fate. American golf, like every major sports culture, always needs stories with clear structure. Winners are celebrated, cheaters are punished, but Greg Norman didn't fit either mold. He was too good to be dismissed, too clean to be convicted, and carried too much regret to be fully embraced. So history had to create a third role, the bearer of regret, a figure people could reference whenever they needed to highlight the cruelty of elite sports without having to confront the unfairness of the system itself. Greg Norman became the price that the American golf story had to pay to keep its moral order from collapsing. In that role, he was mentioned not for what he did wrong, but for what he didn't achieve in the decisive moment. Augusta 1996 became a symbol, not just of one fateful Sunday, but of an unspoken message: even those who do everything right can be left behind. The dangerous part is that message was never fully spoken. It was repeated through sidebar stories, through unconscious comparisons, through the way people placed Greg Norman opposite the right-time champions. In that structure, Greg didn't need to commit a crime. His role was to carry the unease of an entire sport. No one officially declared Greg Norman the symbol of failure, but history doesn't need such declarations. It operates through collective memory, through stories told and retold long enough to become truth. And in those stories, Greg often appeared as a reminder that talent doesn't guarantee happiness, that fairness doesn't always arrive on schedule. He became living proof of a paradox that American golf needed to keep to protect the belief that victory is the privilege of the moment, not of prolonged deserving. The most painful part was that Greg understood it, but could do nothing to escape. He couldn't fight back by accusing the system, because he believed in the rules. He couldn't seek sympathy by admitting mistakes, because there were no moral mistakes to admit. He could only keep living with the role history had assigned him, like a character placed at the center of a lesson he never asked to be taught. His silence once again was interpreted in the way most convenient for the larger story, as acceptance of fate. In that context, Greg Norman became the price American golf paid to maintain balance in its own imagination. If everyone who was the best always got their deserved reward, the game would become too simple, too predictable. There needed to be a figure to remind everyone that greatness doesn't always come with a crown, that the pinnacle can also be the beginning of tragedy. Greg, with his talent, his purity, and his prolonged regret, was perfect for that role. And like every other price, he wasn't asked for his opinion when he was placed on the scale. Greg Norman's moral tragedy therefore wasn't in being openly mistreated, but in being used as a symbol without being acknowledged as a fully human being. When history needed to recall golf's cruelty, they called his name. When it needed an example of doing everything right still not being enough, they mentioned him again. But when it came to resilience, to standing tall even while frozen in memory, the name Greg Norman was rarely placed at the center. And so he kept living, kept existing in a bitter paradox, remembered a lot, but rarely understood correctly. No cheating, no breaking rules, no betraying the game. Greg Norman still had to pay a price as if he had done something wrong. That price wasn't collected in one day, it was collected gradually over the years, through the way history called his name, through the way the story was retold to later generations. It was a price with no receipt, no end date, only a quiet truth. Some people are chosen to carry regret for an entire sport, and Greg Norman was one of the very few who had to bear that role for the rest of his life. While Greg Norman's story was still held in the role of the bearer of regret, the game suddenly found a new face to love, a new icon to place its faith in. Tiger Woods arrived not as a simple successor, but as an earthquake. That explosion brought youthful energy, speed, power, and a much cleaner story for American media. New genius, winning right when needed, dominating at the perfect time. In one moment, golf no longer had to face awkward silences. It had a new hero to tell, a straight-line journey from talent to crown, from grind to glory. The new era arrived fast and fierce, sweeping away the unanswered questions of the past. What had once made Greg Norman complicated, those unrelenting Sundays, those prolonged silences, suddenly became incompatible with the new narrative rhythm. American media, which always needed clear, straight lines, found in Tiger Woods exactly what they'd been waiting for: inevitable victories, green jackets worn on schedule, moments that needed no explanation. The story moved forward, coherent, decisive, and Norman, though still present, was gradually pushed to the side, like an old chapter, not yet closed. Greg was still alive, still competing, still influential, but the story moved on without him. That was the cruelest kind of replacement, not through collapse, but through being passed by. No one told Greg Norman to leave. No one declared him finished. The spotlight simply shifted. When a new story is strong enough, the old one naturally fades, even when the people in it are still breathing, still walking, still trying. For Greg, that feeling was like standing on the side of a road, while the train of history roared past, not bothering to stop and look back. This replacement didn't carry the smell of open bitterness. It came in unconscious comparisons, in articles that named Tiger first, and then mentioned Greg as a contrast. It came in the way audiences began measuring everything by the new standard, where what was once considered great now became merely pre-era. Greg Norman, who once stood at the center of expectation, became a point of comparison for a different future. And in that comparison, his story was simplified, reduced, framed in a few familiar images, with no room left for complexity. The painful part was that Greg didn't resent it. He understood the rules of sports, understood that every era needs its icon, and that icon doesn't wait for anyone. But understanding doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. Being replaced while still alive means watching your own story be retold by others, in others' rhythm, with the focus no longer yours to decide. Greg kept stepping onto the course, kept working, kept holding the dignity of a legend, but deep inside, he knew his role had changed. He was no longer the chapter being written, he was a footnote to a chapter already passed. In that new era, everything moved faster, louder, and with less patience for prolonged pain. American golf had a new hero to lift up, to promote, to tell the next generation, and for that story to be complete, it needed clear distance from what had once caused confusion. Greg Norman became that distance, a shadow big enough to highlight the new light, but no longer invited to center stage, not because he was lesser, but because the story needed to move forward. Being replaced, in Greg's case, wasn't a loss of fame, it was a loss of the right to keep telling his own story. He was still there, but no longer leading. He kept living, but history chose a different path, a different rhythm, where complexity was no longer a priority. And so while the new era drew bright straight lines, Greg Norman remained with the curves of fate, beautiful, deep, but hard to read fully. The story moved on without him at the center, leaving behind a man still present, still contributing, but learning to exist in a world that had decided to look forward without turning back. After the new era swept away center stage, Greg Norman didn't disappear from the golf world. He moved into a different space, where power was no longer measured by Sunday leaderboards, but by long-term influence. Business, golf course design, personal branding, executive roles, Greg entered all of them with the same intensity he'd once brought to the tee box. On the surface, this was a story of rebirth, a legend who knew how to adapt, how to turn experience into value, how to build an empire off the course. But behind the shell of that late career success, the old wound never closed. It didn't bleed loudly, it smoldered, persistent, reminding him that some pains aren't erased by time, they're only pushed deeper. Greg succeeded in business, but every contract signed came with a memory that if life had allowed him to trade for one different moment at Augusta, he would have paid any price. He influenced global golf, but every time he stepped into a shaping role, he felt like he was standing outside a room he once dominated. Success arrived, but no longer pure. It carried the bitterness of compensation, as if everything good that happened afterward had to be read in the light of something never fixed. In the post-career phase, Greg learned to smile in public, learned to talk about vision, about the future, about lasting value. But those closest to him understood that every word was spoken by a man who had never stopped bleeding inside. Not because he lacked pride in what he'd achieved, but because that pride always stood next to an unanswered question. He wasn't obsessed in a destructive way, he was obsessed in a patient way, a quiet presence of regret, enough to change the flavor of every victory that came after. Greg didn't complain, he rarely brought up the wound in direct language, but the wound showed through his choices. He worked more than necessary, as if labor was the only way to keep memory from surging up. He expanded his influence, as if breadth could compensate for the depth of an immeasurable loss. And he kept proving his worth, not to be recognized. He'd had plenty of that already, but to remind himself that life wasn't contained in a single Sunday. What made Greg's post-career so long and painful wasn't a lack of success. It was that every success came with a whisper, if only history had been kinder. If only a putt had fallen the other way. If only one afternoon at Augusta hadn't turned its back. Those if-onlys didn't knock him down, but they made every joy cautious. Greg learned to live with that caution, treating it as the price to pay to keep moving forward without losing himself. In the post-career world, Greg Norman became a man of great influence, but rarely found absolute peace. He built, he led, he shaped, but inside, he was still the man carrying an unstitched cut. Every time he saw golf's new peaks, he didn't envy them. He just realized he'd once stood there with a different, purer belief. And the price of that belief was pain that lasted right up to now. Some wounds don't heal because they don't belong to flesh. They belong to memory, to the original belief in the absolute fairness of the game. Greg never lost faith in golf, he only lost the innocence in that faith. And so his post-career, however brilliant on paper, always carried a deeper emotional layer, where success was no longer the destination, but the means to keep living with pain he'd never been allowed to set down. After decades of living with wounds that never closed, Greg Norman stepped into a chapter that shook the entire golf world. To many, Live Golf was just a controversial project tied to money, power, and complicated political confrontations. But for Greg Norman, Live Golf was never just about money. It was the final voice of a man who refused to disappear in silence. After history pushed him out of the center of the story, after he was frozen in a moment he couldn't control, Greg chose to resist in the only way left, by challenging the very way history gets written. Norman understood full well that he would have to pay a price. He understood that stepping up as the face of Live Golf meant accepting attacks, suspicions about his motives, and the easiest labels slapped on him. But just like throughout his life, Greg didn't choose the safe path. He had once believed in fairness on the golf course, once believed that doing things right was enough. When that belief was betrayed, he didn't break rules, didn't cheat. He chose instead to create a new space where the old power no longer had a monopoly on deciding who got to exist in the story. Live Golf for him was the right to keep being present, to speak, to act, instead of being frozen by history as a sad lesson. When Greg Norman stood in front of the media to defend Live Golf, he didn't speak with the voice of a young rebel. He spoke with the voice of a man who had been stripped of the right to end his story on his own terms. In those eyes there was no naivety, only exhaustion mixed with determination. Norman wasn't trying to erase the past, he was trying to add to it. He knew his final chapter couldn't be Augusta, couldn't be the stolen Sundays, couldn't be being replaced while still alive. Live Golf was the way he wrote one more paragraph that official history hadn't planned to give him the chance to write. The criticism came fast and fierce. Greg was called a disruptor, a man who sold his soul for money, a symbol of division. But amid all those accusations, one thing was rarely mentioned. Greg Norman had lived his entire life in division. Division between talent and outcome. Division between the fairness he believed in and the reality he received. Live Golf was simply the first time he publicly stood on his own side, instead of silently accepting the role others imposed. For Greg, being hated was easier than being forgotten. Norman wasn't naive enough to believe Live Golf would make everyone love him again. He no longer needed that love. What he needed was the right not to be erased from the flow of the present. For many years he had watched golf move forward without him at the center, watched decisions shaping the sport being made by people who had never carried wounds like his. Live Golf was the final knock on the door, a reminder that Greg Norman was still here, still had a voice, still strong enough to shake the seemingly unchangeable structure of world golf. At its core, Live Golf was a personal act of resistance more than a political one. It was the resistance of a man too accustomed to having his story told for him. Norman had once been turned into the symbol of regret, so golf could maintain its moral balance. This time, he refused to keep being the sacrificial figure. He didn't ask history's permission, he challenged it. Not to prove he was right, but to affirm that no one had the right to put a final period on a life still unfolding. The price of this resistance was new isolation. Old friends turned away, doors that once cracked open now slammed shut. Greg Norman knew that feeling all too well. He had been replaced before, pushed out of the center before. But unlike before, this time he stepped into the storm on purpose. He accepted the villain role if necessary, as long as he could write the ending with his own hand. That wasn't arrogance, it was desperation held up by self-respect. Live Golf, therefore, wasn't the most beautiful chapter in Greg Norman's story, but perhaps the most honest. It exposed his entire being, talent, wounds, stubbornness, pride, and the fear of being forgotten. Norman didn't demand history's forgiveness, he only demanded the right to exist in the present, with all the mistakes, controversies, and difficult choices. In his 60s, when many legends choose to step back, Greg Norman stepped forward, knowing every move would be scrutinized many times over. But for someone who had lived his whole life inside a frozen frame, misunderstood, replaced, that was the only choice left. Live Golf was the final act of resistance, not against golf, but against the silence history wanted to impose on him. And however this final chapter would be judged, Greg Norman had achieved what he craved most. He didn't disappear. He forced the world to look back, to argue, to acknowledge that his story had never been simple, and that the man named Greg Norman was still writing the last lines of his life with his own hand, with everything he had left. Passing through the final storm of controversy and resistance, Greg Norman entered his 70s, not as a winner, not as a loser. He entered it as a man carrying the full weight of everything he had lived, believed, and sacrificed. At an age when many seek rest, Greg realized his life had never truly had a real pause. No silence long enough to truly set down the questions, the regrets, the frozen memories. They piled up, accumulated over the years, forming a weight that couldn't be measured by titles or wealth. Health became the cruelest reminder. The body that had once been a perfect machine, that had endured thousands of rounds, decades of peak pressure, now began to respond to everything that had been suppressed. The pains no longer came and went as before. They stayed quiet, but persistent. Every morning waking up was no longer an eager start, but a negotiation with his own body. Greg didn't complain. He understood this was the price of a life that never slowed down, a life that always moved forward, even when it should have stopped. Family, looking back, appeared as a series of moments he had, but not always fully held. The relationships that passed through his life weren't lacking in love, but often lacking in time. Greg wasn't abandoned, nor did he abandon anyone in an easy-to-name way. It's just that when a person lives too long in the spin of expectation and responsibility, presence becomes fragmented. At 70, he looked back with rare clarity, no single family tragedy to blame, only the prolonged exhaustion of years, always putting tomorrow before today. What made that burden deeper was that Greg didn't resent it. He didn't blame the game for betraying him, even on days he believed it had turned its back. He didn't blame the media for changing the story, even though he knew he'd been imprisoned in an image he didn't choose. He also didn't blame himself in a self-destructive way. Greg's heaviness came from acceptance. Acceptance that he had lived true to his belief, even if that belief wasn't rewarded as expected. Acceptance that every choice has a price, and his price was collected gradually, through every decade. At 70, Greg Norman no longer searched for a final explanation for his life. He understood that not every story gets a neat conclusion. Some lives aren't designed to close with a perfect chord, but with a long, heavy, lingering harmony. Looking back, he saw a road without pauses, from youthful absolute belief in fairness, to the peak where mistakes weren't allowed, to the stolen Sundays, to being replaced while still alive, and finally to the act of resistance, so he wouldn't vanish. Each phase followed the next, giving him little time to breathe. That heaviness didn't make Greg collapse. It made him slow down, but not to escape. He began to view everything with the necessary distance, no longer desperate to rewrite history, no longer wanting to argue with it. He carried the losses like part of his own body, impossible to separate, but also no need to hide. There was a sad calm in the way he faced aging, not the calm of someone fully comforted, but of someone accustomed to living with questions that have no answers. In this phase of his life, Greg Norman no longer needed more crowns, nor more battles. What he had was memory, influence, the remaining connections with family, with people who understood him beyond the leaderboard. But even in those seemingly quiet moments, the weight of the past remained. Not overwhelming, not loud, just enough to remind him that he had traveled a very long road, with rarely being allowed to set his luggage down. Greg's 70s weren't an endpoint, they were the place where everything converged at once. Health, family, career, controversies, glory and regret, all standing side by side, none disappearing. He didn't resent because resentment requires belief that things could have been different. Greg had moved past that phase. He simply carried the heavy feeling of a man who had lived fully in a merciless game, who had believed, fought, resisted, and now stood still, not to complain, but to accept that some lives are measured not by happiness, but by endurance. And at 70, the weight of everything Greg Norman had gone through didn't make him smaller, it only made him quieter, more subdued, and more haunted by the truth that his life, however great, had never been light. Stepping out from the accumulated heaviness of 70, Greg Norman's story doesn't need one more twist, doesn't need one more twist, doesn't need justification, and certainly doesn't need someone to fix him to fit neatly into history. Greg Norman isn't a flawed draft. He is a man who lived completely true to his beliefs, and that very truth left cracks that could never be mended. His tragedy isn't in what he did wrong, it's in doing right for too long in a world that doesn't always reward righteousness. Throughout his life, Greg believed in the fairness of the game. He believed that the better player would win, that history would self-correct if you were patient and honest. That belief carried him to the pinnacle, made him an icon, but also bound him to moments when fate refused to let go. When the Sunday at Augusta came and went, Greg didn't lose his honor, didn't lose his talent, he only lost the assurance that doing right was enough. And from then on, he lived as a man carrying a question without a complete answer. Greg Norman doesn't need forgiveness, because he committed no crime. He also doesn't need more glorification through numbers or titles. What he needs, and what history rarely grants generously, is understanding. Understanding that some people don't collapse from mistakes, but from placing absolute faith in values assumed to be unchanging. Understanding that some pains can't be traced to a single moment, they are the result of a lifetime lived with ruthless consistency toward oneself. When people look back at Greg Norman, it's easy to name the fateful Sundays, the missed opportunities, the incomplete chapters. But if that's all they see, the story misses its most important part. Greg didn't quit, he didn't disappear, he didn't destroy what he believed just to be loved more. He accepted being misunderstood, framed, replaced, as long as he didn't betray himself. In a culture that often celebrates only the final result, that steadfastness is easily overlooked. But that's exactly where Greg's tragedy reaches its greatest depth. The message Greg Norman's life sends to American audiences isn't loud or shaped like an easy moral lesson. It's quiet and uncomfortable, like questions you can't brush aside. Not every tragedy comes from error. Some people suffer simply because they believed in the right thing for too long, too absolutely, in a system not designed to protect that purity. Some people aren't allowed to err and then be redeemed, because they lived their entire lives within the boundaries of what is right. Greg Norman is one of the very few like that. He doesn't need salvation through a prettier ending. He needs to be seen as a man who paid the price for his own integrity. When history needed a bearer of regret, Greg was chosen. When the game needed a new chapter, he was pushed aside. When silence became more convenient than understanding, he was left alone with the old questions. And yet he still stood tall, still worked, still influenced, still existed. Not because he felt no pain, but because he didn't know how to live differently from his beliefs. In this final part, the story doesn't close with victory or defeat, it closes with acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that Greg Norman isn't a paradox to be explained, he's a reality to be felt. A man who could be both great and pained, both right and unrewarded, both fully lived and carrying irremovable loss. And if there's one thing worth keeping from that life, it's not the regret, it's respect for those who chose right even when they knew the price might be their entire life. Greg Norman doesn't need to be rewritten, he needs to be understood, in the silence, in the pain, and in the truth that some people don't break because they were wrong, they break because they did right to the end. When looking back at the entire story of Greg Norman, the most heartbreaking thing isn't the specific failures, it's the way a man who lived true to his beliefs had to carry pain for a lifetime. Greg didn't collapse from lack of talent, he dominated world golf for 331 weeks, became the great white shark, stood at the peak where all of America placed a crown on his head. The tragedy began at the moment of Augusta 1996, not as an ordinary comeback loss, but as the day everything he believed about golf's fairness suddenly betrayed him. From then on, his life froze in a single frame, even though he kept competing, kept winning, kept living. Even more heartbreaking is that Greg was never forgiven because he never committed a crime. No cheating, no rule breaking, no excuses. He was chosen by history as the bearer of regret, so American golf could keep its story balanced. When Tiger Woods arrived, the new era swept everything away, and Greg was replaced while still alive, the coldest form of loss. His personal life had no refuge either. Marriage eroded, family cracked, the golf course was both the only place he could be himself and the place that took everything else away. Even when he moved into business, built influence, and finally resisted with live golf, every post-career success carried the bitterness of an unhealed wound. At 70, he didn't resent. He simply carried on his shoulders the accumulated weight of a life without real pause. The lesson for American people from this story is clear and deeply uncomfortable. Not every tragedy comes from mistakes. Some people suffer simply because they believed in the right thing for too long, too absolutely. Greg Norman's life reminds us that success doesn't always bring peace, and society needs to learn understanding, not just celebration of the ultimate winner. If Greg Norman's story of quiet pain and unyielding dignity has made you reflect, please subscribe to the channel to keep joining us on these authentic journeys behind the spotlight of sports. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video where we continue exploring great but never simple destinies.